Hey guys, it's Mike Lapierre. Just checking in on what is today, May the 26th, I think it is, 2016. Thursday the 26th, does that sound right? Yeah, I think it does. Anyway, let's not fuss over the date. It's not why we called you here today. Let's see, back in the early 2000s, I was the creator and host of a little TV show called Gun Owner Against Violence. And with the combination of popular demand, people asking me to resurrect that, and just my personal level of interest in it and the timeliness of it with the elections and all of that, the whole gun rights, gun control debate that's going on right now, I dare say raging right now, thinking strongly about bringing that back. So maybe this will be episode 1. You might have seen some of my recent recordings on the topic. So maybe this will be episode 1B, who knows. So what are we here to talk about today? I want to talk about mostly private transfers of firearms. I want to talk a little bit about the universal background checks that are being talked about. I have already addressed that, so I'll be very brief on that. I am not for them. I'm fine with the existing background checks. And I'll clarify that. The existing background checks, if you go into a store, any kind of retailer to buy a firearm, you have to have what's called a background check. They call it the NICS background check, NICS. I think it's the National Instant Check System. I think that's what it is. It's an instant check. They gather some information, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and it's a quick, you either pass it or you fail it. Now, if you're denied a purchase, this is one of the reasons I'm against the expanded background checks. Those denials, there's been over 1 million denials in the last 15 years or so. And there's probably been less than 100 that have been investigated and prosecuted. Now, I don't know about you, but if a prohibited person attempts to buy a firearm, I consider that a pretty serious thing. But apparently our federal government does not. What the hell kind of priority is that? But at the same time, they're advancing this whole gun control scheme with universal background checks, expanded background checks, trying to expand this flawed thing where you get someone who's denied and they're not even investigating or prosecuting that. Now, there's two types of denials. There's a false positive, which is, say someone like myself who's a lawful gun owner, got a clean criminal history, background, and there's some kind of error in maybe a clerical error that was made. Maybe a junior, senior thing, or someone else with the same name. And you get denied, but it's a lawful purchaser who got denied, and that can cost them thousands of dollars to straighten that out. And then on the other side of it, you've got a flawed database, where there's a lot of people who should be in that database, prohibited people who should be in that database, and who are not. And that's not acceptable either. And whether it's a false positive or a real positive, the FBI or the ATF or whoever is doing that, federal authorities, ought to be investigating and prosecuting anyone that is found truly a prohibited purchaser, attempted purchaser. So those are a couple of things that a couple of the reasons why I have issues with the expanded background checks. I'm fine with the existing background checks as long as it's a pass or fail and they're not collecting any information about what's being purchased and the records are expunged when it's finished. The other thing I don't like about the expanded background checks is and we've talked about this before, I'm going to pose this as a question: what is the plan for making lawless criminals comply with the background checks? What is the plan for making lawless criminals comply with those background checks? There's no plan. It's not possible. It's unenforceable. Even law enforcement has problems with it and rejects it and has had class action lawsuits. I think it was in Colorado. The sheriffs, I think 50 or 60 sheriffs in the state, organized to do a class action lawsuit. Also, the other big problem with these expanded background checks is there's some creative interpretations of what constitutes a transfer. And these creative interpretations of what constitutes a transfer are all directed at not criminals or criminal misuse, but lawful gun owners. I'll give you a few examples. And this has happened to me once in the past. I was out hunting with a buddy of mine. We were rabbit hunting, and I was having a problem with my gun. The firing pin wasn't working. The gun wouldn't fire. Thankfully, my buddy that I was with, he had a firearm, an extra firearm in his vehicle, and he loaned it to me for the day, and we went off and had a great hunt. I don't think we got it. I think he might have got a rabbit. I don't remember. But we had a great time. And there was no interruption in the hunt other than a couple of minutes to work that out and him to loan me the firearm. But under these creative interpretations of what constitutes a transfer, we would have had to, that would constitute a transfer. We would have to go back into town, find an open gun store, probably at 5 o'clock in the morning. This was at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning that day. Pay whatever the fee is for a background check for him to loan me that firearm, and at the end of the hunt, we would have to do another background check for him to retake the gun back. That's just bullshit, idiotic insanity, not targeted at criminals or criminal misusers of firearms. Also, you get loans between family members. You get a situation where someone's at a shooting range. Hey, you want to try this gun? Then that happens all the time at a shooting range. You know, people are checking out each other's firearms. This is all in a very safe context. I try yours, you try mine, and that's pretty cool. I might think about getting one of those someday. While doing that, you have to stop, go into town, do the background check for your friend to shoot your rifle a couple of times, and then for you to give it back to your friend. That's another background check, another trip back into town. It's not practical, it's not enforceable. It's just a whole bunch of harassment of lawful gun owners. It's absolutely nothing to do with criminals or criminal misuse. Another option that I've heard of is you get a gentleman who's in the military and he wants to leave a firearm for protection for his wife or live-in girlfriend, and for him to do that constitutes a transfer. And a lot of this, you know, he wouldn't leave it with her if she wasn't trained and competent in the use of it. So this has nothing to do with crime or criminals, criminal misuse, prohibited people, or any of that. It's just jumping through hoops and creating legal traps for lawful gun owners. You could be dealing with jail time or thousands of dollars in legal fees, either fines or legal fees to get it straightened out. So those are the reasons why I'm against it. Now, private transfers are what I wanted to talk about today, and I'm going to talk about that right now. And this is as much a question as it is a comment. It's an idea I had, and I want to pose it as an idea. I wanted to get feedback from fellow gun owners and see what they think, if this is viable. When we do private transfers, private sales of a firearm, if I sell you a firearm or you sell me a firearm, we have a lot of liability. We have a lot of skin in that game. And I'll give you an example. If I sell you a firearm and you turn around and use that in a crime, I'm on the culpability flow chart. And I could face, it's a federal crime, I could face maybe 5 to 10 years in jail time. I forget the sentencing guidelines. It's at least 5 years, possibly 10. So I am very much in the loop, and I have some serious liability in that. So, you know, lawful gun owners doing private transfers have a lot of, there's a lot of gravity there to make sure that happens correctly, and you're not selling that to a prohibited person or a criminal or someone with criminal intent or someone doing a straw purchase. A straw purchase is when, let's say I have a criminal background and I know I'm not going to be able to pass a background check. So I go to a friend of mine I know who will pass and say, hey dude, here's some cash, will you buy that firearm for me? And I'll give you the cash, you buy it, give it to me. That's a straw purchase. That's also a federal crime. And the person who did that who did the straw purchase is looking at, I think, 5 years, up to 5 years of sentencing guideline. And myself, who's the person who initiated that and used a subterfuge to buy a firearm, I'm looking at up to 10 years. So there's it's already serious laws to try to keep firearms out of the wrong hands. We're just not prosecuting them to the fullest extent. So getting to the idea that I had, when you walk into a store to buy a firearm, you have to fill out what's called a form number 4473. Now the 4473 at the very top of it says lying on this form is punishable by up to 10 years and or a $250,000 fine. That's a federal crime. It's going to spend some quality time in club fed if you're caught doing that. Or that's the way it should happen. The sentencing guidelines are, I'd have to check, but up to 5 or 10 years, but it's not being applied. The judges aren't applying it. But it's a good form. Lower down on the form, and I'm going to put an image of the form up, but going on memory, it asks you whether or not you were the actual buyer to try to vet whether or not you're making a straw purchase. Asked about felony indictments and convictions. Are you a fugitive from justice? What else? Are you an unlawful drug user or an addict? Have you ever been adjudicated mentally defective? Do you have a restraining order? And there's a few others. I can't think of them all right now. I'm just going off the top of my head. But it's asking some pretty serious questions. And if you falsify the information on that, you've also got your name and address, probably your date of birth and a signature, and then they run a background check. But if you're falsifying that information, that is a federal crime. That's a serious crime. It should be prosecuted. And if you ask me, a prohibited person lying on that form attempting to buy a firearm, that's a very serious thing that should be taken seriously. So where am I going with this? In a private sale, we since we're exposed to so much liability, most of us don't have the ability to do a background check, but we do have the ability to print off a copy of the form 4473 and insist that our buyer fill it out and subject themselves to that same liability and that same penalty if they lie on that form. I think that's a damn good idea, and that shows diligence on our part, on the part of a lawful seller doing a private sale, shows diligence to make sure that we made a diligent effort to make sure that that person is not a prohibited person. I also think it's probably a good idea to take with your cell phone, take a picture of their driver's license. And if you've got an ad somewhere selling your gun, mention that right up front. Or if you're having a phone conversation with someone, or it's a friend of a friend, you mention that anytime I sell a gun, I insist on having the buyer fill out the form 4473 and take a picture of their license, just to show diligence that I'm not willingly selling a firearm to a prohibited person. And any lawful gun purchaser isn't going to have a problem with that. A criminal or a prohibited person will have a problem with that, and they may or may not say they have a problem with it, or they may just, sputter a few excuses and get the hell out of there. And that's fine. It's doing its job. It's working. So that's the question I posed today, is what do you guys think, lawful gun owners and people who are familiar with this, and even people who aren't familiar with this, how do you feel about that? Is that sound practice for a lawful person doing a private sale or transfer of a firearm? Is that in the eyes of a judge or the law, does that show rigorous diligence on your part to try to vet out people who would criminally misuse that firearm? Also, it's worth talking about the sentencing guidelines for people who use a firearm to commit a crime, who commit a crime with a firearm in their possession, and for prohibited persons caught with a firearm in their possession. Each of those are looking at up to 10 years of sentencing guidelines. Club Fed, these are federal sentencing guidelines. It's a federal crime. It's a serious, serious thing. And as far as I'm concerned, it is a serious offense if someone commits a crime with a firearm or has a firearm in their possession during the commission of a crime, or a prohibited person in possession of a firearm. Those are very serious things. And the gun control crowd, the anti-gunners, all they talk about is keeping the guns out of the wrong hands, but everything they're talking about and doing, it's all pointed at the lawful gun owners. They don't care if those sentencing guidelines aren't being used. The judges aren't using those sentencing guidelines. They're giving them light sentences, sometimes even probation, and they go out back on the streets and commit the same crime. And the cycle continues. If it were up to me, I've got no problem with those kind of offenses, any of those, whether it's straw purchases, committing a crime with a firearm, having a firearm in your possession during the commission of a crime, prohibited person in possession. I got no problem with 20 years to life. If it were up to me, I would up those sentences, and I would implement those guidelines to the fullest extent of the law. Those are serious, serious offenses. Those are things that compromise public safety. But are we doing that? No, we're not doing that. That's not a priority for the current administration or the federal government. All they want to do is obsess over the wrong demographic, lawful gun owners. And as long as that's happening, it's going to get nowhere. Gun control is going to get nowhere unless they dig a little deeper and deal with the real problems. We have a gang problem in this country. 80%, as of 2013, 80% of firearm-related homicides were gang-related. That's the number we should be caring about, I would think. It's pretty important. It's about 8,000 firearm deaths Those are all gang related, but no one wants to talk about gangs. And we all know why. No one wants to get into the racial thing. And I understand their intentions there and the sensitivities, and that's all well and good, but I don't care what race you are. If you're involved in criminal activity, you're equally accountable. With equal rights comes equal accountability. There's no wiggling out of that. There's no bullshit factor. I don't care what your race is at that point. Got nothing against any race, but it doesn't matter what your race is. If you're victimizing and compromising the safety of innocent people, that's a problem. That is a serious problem. You are not fit to be in society with civilized people, and you belong behind bars for a very long time. There's nothing acceptable about that. But that's not the priority. The priority is obsessing over lawful gun owners who like to stand on empty tennis courts and do their gun rants. So, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Thanks for hanging out on the empty tennis court with me. And we'll talk to you next time.